My father is the most principled person that I know. To a fault, annoyingly to a fault sometimes. But I deeply respect it. My mother is very different. My mother can do nearly anything, an incredible amount of energy every time and positivity. But what is common across both of them that I think that I live by is they both work extremely hard. The one fiction book that I read and reread on a regular basis is Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. It's basically centered around the idea of a mathematician who invents a branch of mathematics to predict the future using law of large numbers. We had a big launch. We had a launch in Delhi, then we had one in Bangalore, Jaipur Literary Festival, London, they started world tour. And our goal, by the way, is to translate and publish these books for the next 100 years. We've done 50 volumes. These 50 volumes that we have done span 14 languages. It spans about 2,500 years of Indian history and literary tradition. Our own people in India, we read our own classics. It's important that the world reads it, the world values it. Of course, there's value and merit to it. I don't deny it.
Welcome to the Expressions podcast. Today, we have someone really special. It's none other than Rohan Murty, the founder of the Murty Classical Library. Growing up in the Murty household, Rohan found his true calling, cracking code at the age of 9. From here, we trace his journey through acing high school and college and his diverse readings of history and philosophy to becoming a fellow at Harvard and an AI entrepreneur. Come join us as we hear it from the man himself. Rohan Murty, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Neha.
We'll begin on a lighter note. What kind of books do you read?
So my favorite books are non-fiction books. Specifically, I love reading about history of science. So, for example, some of my favorite books I'll split into this. Non-fiction books, but part of that is history of science books and then just history, general history. So, for example, in history of science, I enjoy one of my favorite books is a book called Faust in Copenhagen. It's about the history and the birth of quantum mechanics, but told in this very dramatic kind of, you literally feel like you're reading about a film, and there's mystery and characters interacting with each other and emotions, all tied to the history of quantum mechanics. Or Simon Singh's book on Fermat's last theorem or Fermat's enigma and so on, which is on the grand old problems of mathematics and how it was finally solved. And there's a lot of drama and tension around it. So I enjoy these kinds of nerdy books. But I also read a lot of, for example, Byzantine history, history of different religions, and so on. So, but all generally non-fiction. But the one exception is the one fiction book that I read and reread on a regular basis is Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. It's basically centered around the idea of a mathematician who invents a branch of mathematics to predict the future using law of large numbers and so on. So,
have you read your mom's books?
Good question. Only some. Actually, in the early days, so my mom and I had a compact when she used to write, when she was writing. I'd say to her, okay, I'm studying for my exams, and we used to have our dining table is a little smaller than this, and I would say to her, you have to sit at the same dining table, and when I'm studying, you can do what you want here. So she would write when I was studying. And then in between my breaks, I would ask her, what are you writing? And then I'll read, and so on. So I used to read her drafts. But now then she's been writing so much and so on over the years that I've not kept up.
Nice. And do you follow any fitness regimen?
Yes. My wife has injected a little bit of discipline into me in this regard. I used to run actually very regularly in the last few years. But then I was not very bright. I didn't realize that if you do a lot of running but you don't do strength training, you lose muscle mass. And to begin with, I don't have much weight or muscle mass to lose, so that was not a good thing. And so instead, I do yoga and I swim and things like that.
And what kind of food do you like? Do you eat out a lot?
No, I don't like to eat out at all. No. I only want to eat at home.
Okay.
And in that, I primarily only prefer eating South Indian food. So that's what, as I'm growing older, that's what I realize that's what I'm most comfortable with. Not to suggest other kinds of food are not wonderful. When I was younger, I never wanted to eat at home. I used to think home food was the worst. But, after a certain age, now I feel home food is the best. So.
Sadhu?
So in Karnataka, that's Anna Masuru, but also, my mother is from the northern part of Karnataka where we eat bhakri,
Okay.
like jova roti.
Yeah.
And then there are certain kinds of ways in which you make sabji and so on. But generally, South. I'd say Karnataka food, and my wife is Tamilian, so Tamil Nadu food.
Yes. And do you follow any fashion trends?
No.
Okay. You acquired an interest in computer and coding at a very young age and went on doing PhD on it. So were you a computer nerd?
I don't know about nerd. See, when I was young, in my school, for a long time, I had very few to no friends. I had 2 friends. I didn't talk to anyone. I was also consistently amongst the bottom ranked students in my class.
Really?
Yeah, this is up to a certain point.
Okay.
And I used to look around. There were students who were good at debate. There were students who were good at sports, elocution. And I went to Bishop Cotton Boys where, I think the school encouraged students to do a lot of things.
Yeah.
But I had nothing. And I had nothing where I felt, hey, maybe I know something, I can do something. And I think that general kind of weariness was there in all aspects of my life. And it was by total random accident. When I was 4th standard is maybe 8 years young.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So my mother thought, I have no hobby, I have nothing. So maybe she should make me go to the house and do something. And growing up in Jayanagar, there used to be a place called Brilliant's Tutorials. Those days, I don't know if the company exists anymore. It was near my house. So my mom took me there and put me into programming class. Not because she thought I could do it. She just thought it's an excuse because I couldn't play cricket. I could do nothing, at least. And this class had people in their 20s and 30s who were learning programming. And then there was me. And the first 2-3 months, just because I was like, okay, at least I'm told I should do something, I'll sit here. But I didn't understand anything. But at some point, maybe after 3 months, I don't know what it is, but suddenly everything clicked. And everything that the teacher was teaching, let me not say everything, but many things suddenly made sense. I was like, oh, this is how these things fit together. I can solve these problems and so on. And within about 6 months, that had completely taken hold of me. And I felt I have something that where I can connect with it, I can be good at it.
Nice.
Now, I don't know if I'm better than anyone else or not, nor did I care. But it meant something to me.
Yeah.
And before long, I started to write more complex code, more complex projects. I started with basic programming. And when I was 9, my mother put me into, then I went back and I told her, hey, I want to learn more. I want to learn C programming. And so when I was 9 years old, I joined a C programming class in AppTech. Again, I don't know if that company is around now or not. It was this training. Yeah. So I learned C and Unix when I was 9. By the time I was 9.5 or 10, I was writing fairly sophisticated sort of code, far more than what I've probably written since that age. And then I suddenly felt like this was my way of expressing. See, there are people when they paint or they play music, they're all forms of expression, right? And gives you maybe confidence.
Yeah.
For me, my sense of confidence and expression of myself came through code. And I don't know what is the economic value of it. I had nothing because you're young. Yeah? I mean, 5th standard writing C code. Yeah. I'm not thinking of any career or anything. But overnight, it changed my personality. Suddenly, I was deeply focused. I knew what I wanted to do. I knew how I wanted to spend time. And overnight, I went from the bottom 5 students in class to being amongst the top 2. Everything changed for me. My entire sense of self and confidence came from finding one thing that I thought I could connect with. And I suspect there are many children like this. Right? And they have to just find that outlet.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? And so for me, since then, it has been my forever companion. Even now, I make it a point to spend some time, no matter what I'm doing, to write some code because it gives me a way of. I haven't figured out how to fully express it, but I think it's a deeply expressive medium. Just as poetry, writing, painting, or whatever else are all expressive, artistic expressions, code is no different. Same thing with mathematics, it's no different.
And what would you count as your major failures and what learnings from them?
There were things that at the time I perceived as great failures. Over time I realized these were not failures. Or in the grand scheme of things, these things didn't matter. That has probably been the pattern. That's what. There are very few things that I hang on to thinking of them as, oh my God, major failure. Give an example. In my school, eventually I became a very good student. I was always amongst the top 2 or 3. Some 10th standard exam. For whatever reason at that time, I was actually building the beginnings of an operating system. And I felt, I was writing all this code by myself. I felt that was more important than studying for my board exams. So literally in the middle of my board exams every day, I'm spending hours together writing code instead of studying for my exams. So when the results came for my 10th standard exam, I was not in the top 2 or 3, maybe in the top 20 or 30. At the time, I thought it was a big failure. In retrospect, it didn't matter. Actually, I'm glad I pursued what I wanted to do. When I finished my 12th, I was amongst the top 2 or 3 from my school, and sure. So I think in some sense, for me, to a reasonable extent, failures are always at a point in time in a certain context. And maybe when the context and time changes, maybe you learn to grow up and say, okay, maybe that's okay. At least maybe I can learn from that experience and maybe not make the same mistake twice, right? Things like that.
So you are the son of Narayan and Sudha Murty, both being legends. How difficult was it to chart your own independent course in life? Did staying in a different country help?
The things that have made the biggest differences have been this. I have a small circle of friends whom I trust immensely, who are friends with me. When I make mistakes, they never shy to remind me I made mistakes. Or when I do well, then they're supportive. That makes a nice difference. There are 3 phases in this. There's a certain phase where I used to be agnostic to all this. Certain phase where I used to be sensitive. But as I grow older now, I feel very fortunate and blessed that at least seemingly for no credit to myself, I'm born into a very fortunate set of circumstances. Or let me not even say that. I'm the beneficiary of a fortunate set of circumstances that I don't control. And rather than look at the situation negatively, I embrace it with more joy and pride in my family, and I don't dwell on it much.
Your father is far more strict than what it is, how he appears in public. So, what are the important lessons that you remember? Any lessons that you learned from your mom and dad?
Let me say, I try to learn. I try to live by them. I'm not always as successful. My father is the most principled person that I know. To a fault, unknowingly to a fault sometimes. But I deeply respect him. And he's also amongst the most fair people that I know. At least he tries to be. No one is perfect. And he's very consistent with this. I'm not sure. I'm not him. So I don't know if I will ever be like that. And on the other hand, my mother has a totally different vibe. Like my father has one thing in his life that he spent his whole life doing, and that's all that he's dedicated his life to. It's filled with ideas and principles and ideals. I mean, that's of course his work in building the company and so on. And the best expressions of himself he put into that company and so on. And so I see him as this person who's deeply dedicated to one thing. My mother is very different. My mother can do nearly anything. She doesn't seek, like my father doesn't seek to do nearly everything. He wants to only do one thing. Whereas my mother is, there's always a new reinvention. An incredible amount of energy every time and positivity. So I see that as the older I grow, the more I want to imbibe that as well. I think I've learned my father's seriousness and focus and discipline. But my mother's ability to endlessly manufacture energy and do new things, that I'm still attempting to emulate. But what is common across both of them that I think that I live by is they both work extremely hard. And they always have. And it comes from a place of very deep belief and passion, I suspect. I think I inherit the same way of life.
I read that you bought 2 wooden chairs from your school at the Bishop Cottons when they were doing renovations. So, are you sentimental about these things?
No, the story is that. So, growing up in Bangalore, I went to Bishop Cottons from kindergarten to 12th. That's 14 years.
Yes.
And my school's a very old school, started in 1865. And obviously, it has many cherished old buildings in it. In some sense, it's tied into the history of Bangalore itself. And so, a few years ago, and the names fail me, the principal came to meet me to say, hey, we want to fundraise, will you give us money? I said, yeah, I'm happy to consider it. For what? And he said, we're building some fancy new center and boardroom and this and that. So I said, where's the room for this?
Yeah.
He said, no, we're breaking down the school hall and building this. And I was absolutely terrified by that idea. And I said, because our school hall is it's not just important for Bishop Cottons, it's important for Bangalore.
Yeah.
It's a very old
Heritage,
building. It's a heritage building and a lovely old building. And so I asked him why. And he said, no, you see, there are all these other international schools coming up. We have to compete and this and that. I understand the need or desire to do all of these things. But I don't run the school, but my own limited perspective was, these are not the ways to compete with these schools.
Yeah.
I think the strength of Bishop Cottons was not that you can come play golf or polo or whatever it is, or that we have the best infrastructure. No. The strength of Bishop Cottons was, at least once upon a time, now I don't know, I'm not in touch with the school as much, it attracted the best students, or let me not even say best, it attracted good students and put them in a classroom and we all learned from each other. That's it. And we didn't, or at least so I offered him saying, no, if you keep the school hall, I'll give you money for that.
Yeah.
I'm not going to give you money to break it down. Obviously, it's not hard to raise money for these things.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, they took a very short-sighted decision, in my opinion, that is a loss to the school, loss to Bangalore, and is also, in some sense, it's symptomatic of often what our society is missing. We don't respect our own history, right? We don't use in some instances, actually this is not a broader point, in some instances, we don't view our history as our strength.
Yeah.
Right? And I would have, because that school hall, it's a beautiful old hall.
Yeah.
And it had these wooden rafters all around, which had the names of, for the last 100 years, the best athlete or whatever, these different names of the best students every year, I guess in some shape or form.
Yeah.
Maybe the captain or whatever, I don't know. I don't remember now.
Yeah.
And I was very surprised because when the same people, right, we Indians, we go visit other countries and say, wow, look how they have maintained. Why don't we maintain our own, right? And so we were very sad, I think all of us alums, now there's some ghastly building and so on, but to be fair, it's not just Bishop Cottons. This is probably true in Bangalore in many places, right? So I think some of those wooden rafters were, I heard they were sold. And so one of the alums bought them and made some 50 chairs. So a couple of us alumni got together and bought these chairs. And that's the last cherished piece of this very old building that I have. But I don't like anyone to sit on it. So it's...
So can you talk to us about your stint at Harvard and how did people react to your interest in philosophy while being a computer science student?
Yeah, and whatever I may say next, again, maybe limitations that I have, or maybe my limited perspectives, though I suspect it's more widespread than one would think. See, when I was doing my PhD, somehow I'd grown up with a limited one-dimensional perspective. Okay, science is done a certain way, and science is everything, and science.
Yeah.
When my sister studied economics and French, I told her, oh my God, what a shame to our family. So, I'm younger than my sister, so I was obviously more foolish. And I said, look, everyone in our family have done science or engineering, or doing economics and French. How will you get a job? Right? I think in time I was wrong, clearly. And so I had this very limited perspective as a first-year PhD student. I even thought the way to do scientific inquiry was certain way only. Right? And this kind of view stems from a lack of appreciating the humanities. For a variety of reasons, and so like even when we study, I remember science students studying history. There's no history in 11th or 12th standard, at least in my school.
Yeah.
And there was some English and this and that. But those, I believe our study of these things were more mechanical versus studying the aesthetics of whatever we read, whether it is Kannada, English, Hindi, etc. and so on. So when you don't appreciate the aesthetics and you don't appreciate the arguments made in how maybe arguments in literature are different from arguments in mathematics, right, and so on, you end up with a limited view. And I think this is more common in our country. But at that point, I made lots of friends who were not scientists. Most of my friends ended up being philosophers, historians, political scientists, economists, all PhD students. And I thought the kinds of problems they thought about, the kinds of things they debated, and the way they debated were entirely different.
Yeah.
And I used to think, like one of my friends he was writing a book on the history of doors and windows. This was a little bit later on. I never thought of the history of doors and windows, but how interesting that someone can even think of that as a topic, right? And so on. Anyway, so one thing led to another, and I landed up taking a philosophy class. It was epistemology in 5th century India.
Okay.
I didn't know what the word epistemology meant at the time.
What is it? Even I don't know actually.
It is how do you know what you know?
Okay.
Okay, so it's one way of just, a simplified explanation. And it was just 12 students. And I spoke to the professor saying, look, I don't know anything about philosophy. He said, look, can you read 200 to 300 pages a week? And if you can, we meet once a week for 3 hours. We sit around a round table. There are only 10 to 11 students.
Okay.
And we just discuss what we read. And I thought, oh, okay, maybe I can do that. And I read, so I began to read philosophy every week. And the very nature of how sentences are constructed is so different from scientific writing that that's the only kind of thing I was largely familiar with.
Yeah.
The arguments that they make of why a certain argument is right or this or that, etc. I found it utterly fascinating and different from everything that I was doing.
And that got you...
Yeah. So, for example, we were debating, what is perception? And these are all classic questions in these kinds of areas. Is, like if you have a red flower, is red the property of the flower or is it something else that's born in your eyes, etc. and things like this. And we were studying this in the context of Sanskrit philosophy.
Okay.
Roughly 5th century or so. And that entire semester doing this changed my perspective forever.
Okay.
Because I enjoyed it so much. Once a week, I got to think about something very different from my work.
Yeah.
Talk to people who spoke in a different way, who thought in a different way.
Yeah.
And at the end of it, I realized that, maybe there are more ways of doing inquiry in life than just one particular way that I was
questioning.
Aware of. Yeah. And that opened up my perspective. I believe it made me a far better scientist as a result. And since then, I took courses in history of religion, just history in general, and then philosophy very regularly for the remainder of my stay as a PhD student. Shloka Vartika is, I think, one of the chapters of it. But it's been many years. We read lots of things. We read, philosophy and grammar, semantics, and various things like this.
Okay.
But it opened up in fact, if I had to do my education over again, I would expose myself to these kinds of things much earlier on.
Why?
Like, for example, I would definitely do computer science, as I think that's what I'm good at.
Yeah.
But I would do maybe history and philosophy as 2 additional degrees, for sure.
Why? Why do you think?
I don't, the humanities more broadly.
Yeah.
Studying the humanities is about studying the ways that we live, the ways that we live, how we
Civilization
think,
started.
how we feel. These transcend often, right? I mean, transcend time, transcend people. I think there's tremendous merit to it.
Yes.
And it gives you entirely different perspectives of life.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. So when I studied philosophy seriously enough in graduate school, I suspect I mean, so much so that, people thought I'm trying to get a master's and all these things. That was not the point. Though I suspect I may have enough credits for these things. I thought at one point, when I was 22 or 23, I decided I want to know the answer to what is the meaning of life.
Okay.
Many people ask this question at different points in their time in their life. So I thought, okay, so my superpower is research and homework. Okay, so I'll just take these classes, I'll read these books, and I'll know the answer. But the more I read it, I realized there's no answer to this question. And it's what you make of it and what you find peace with. And maybe the answer evolves over time.
Yeah.
Right? So the study of humanities in some sense is I think, as deep as study of science, but in a very different way.
And if you could go back in time, which era would you want to go to and relive?
No, I don't think I would ever want to go back in time and live in any other era. Because every era has its own pluses and minuses. For example, I was talking about this history of quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
All of that happened in Copenhagen. I would have loved to have been part of that environment in some way.
Yeah.
And met all these people. But then after that, there was World War II.
Yeah.
Right? And, it was a pretty awful time to live in Europe at that time. As an example, would I wanted to have lived under British India? Given a choice, I'm not so sure. Right? It was a tough time.
Yeah.
That's why our forefathers, and foremothers fought for our freedoms. So I don't know if I would ever want to go live in any previous period of time. I think for any person at any point in time, the time that they live in is probably the most reasonable.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about other periods of time, that's all.
Your work on white spaces networking has won several awards. Could you explain to us in layman terms what this means actually?
Sure. This was during my PhD days. My research back then was on network communications, to put it very kind of broadly. The idea here was simply this. This is, I'm talking about in the late 2000s. We've heard of all of these spectrum and so on in India, right? So you have wireless spectrum that's auctioned off and so on. The idea in my thesis, where I built a system to demonstrate this, was what if you nobody was given spectrum, nobody was allocated spectrum forever. Instead, because spectrum is a shared resource, it's a common resource, common to all of us. So if you wanted to communicate with each other, you find some portion of the spectrum that's empty at this point in time, use it, communicate, and then you're done, you let go.
Yeah.
So it's highly opportunistic and dynamic in this way. There are not too many systems built to do that. So one of the systems that I built was the first one, where what it did was it transmitted data, but over television spectrum. Frequencies of what are used by TV stations. If you remember back in the day, we used to watch TV by sticking these big antenna.
Yeah.
The TV tower is some 100 kilometers from your house, and the signal is coming deep into your house, and you're able to get reception clearly.
Yeah.
What if you could send data over the same distance? You could have one access point for the whole city,
Interesting.
right? Or the whole, for like a big area.
Yeah.
So the first such system to be built that demonstrated something like that was what I did for my thesis, PhD thesis.
Very interesting.
So that's what white space is, that portion of the TV spectrum that's unused.
Okay.
Because today most people don't watch TV that way. They watch it through cable, right? Not through the air, right? So
you've been a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. Can you tell us about your association with Nobel laureate Amartya Sen? Did you have?
Yeah, sure. The Society of Fellows is maybe close to 100-year establishment at Harvard. What they do is, the idea is, when they started it was, you should have just finished your PhD. Can be in any discipline and from any university. You don't have to be from Harvard. Any university on the planet. And for 3 years, they think as soon as you finish your PhD, that's your most fertile time for your mind. So you shouldn't teach or be on committees or do any of this. You should just pursue your research with no questions asked. So you get a nice research budget, you get a nice office, and no questions asked. Do whatever you want for 3 years. The only requirement they have is they pick 10 people a year. And for 3 years, you're then called a junior fellow. So 10 times 3 is 30 of us at a given time. We meet in this somewhat, not so secret, but somewhat hidden dining room 3 times a week. 1 dinner, 2 lunches, where we are supposed to eat together. Because their whole point is we are selecting a very eclectic group of people who are all top of their fields. And if you all talk to each other, you learn from each other. And so this is something it turns out you can't apply to. Someone has to nominate you and they get lots of nominations, then they whittle it down and ultimately they select 10 people a year across the globe. And once you're done, you're a former fellow for life. So I was a junior fellow there. And so, they had very eclectic people, like my year, computer scientist. Then they had one of my year, there was someone who's studying egg-laying patterns in cuckoos and was now a professor at Princeton. Then they had someone who was studying the history of doors and windows, a historian, a good friend of mine who's now a professor at NYU. Then they had some geneticist who's now a professor at Harvard. Then they had a musician who's a professor at Dartmouth. It's a very eclectic group.
Very interesting.
And we had to eat, and the dinners are quite legendary. They start at 6 p.m. on every Monday. This is mandatory. Because they're like, look, it's the gift of gab or gift of conversation. We want you to talk to each other and learn from each other.
Okay.
And the dinners would start at 6 p.m. and go till 4 a.m. or as late as you want to go. Every week you had to do dinner and 2 lunches together. And so we were 30 junior fellows and there are 10 senior fellows.
Okay.
Senior fellows are very well-known established academics at Harvard. So for example, Wally Gilbert was a Nobel laureate.
Yeah.
Was, I think, probably the only successful entrepreneur Nobel laureate. He was a professor at Harvard, the first biophysicist at Harvard. He started Biogen.
Okay.
He was a chairman of the Society of Fellows when I was there. Extraordinary scientist and then entrepreneur, now artist, professor. Then Amartya, of course, was a senior fellow. Then we had a well-known mathematician, a well-known literature person, a well-known historian of science, and so on. So the 40 of us ate together regularly. And so through this, you get to know everyone. So I got to know Amartya very well. Of course, to us Indians, he's a very well-accomplished intellectual hero.
Yeah.
Right, in economics
It's
and
been
many
great
other
learning,
fields.
being in that.
Yeah, because we ate together regularly every week,
Yeah.
right? And I remember in the beginning, I used to keep saying, Professor Sen, Professor Sen. He's like, no, now we're fellows together. You can't call me that. You have to say Amartya. And it took me, being Indian, for us, for obvious reasons, very hard to go to any senior person on a first name basis. It took me a lot of trying and so on. So, but yeah, it was the most unique experience being a fellow there in terms of, the conversation, the debate, the learnings, and the diversity of scholars that, you become friends with. So.
You envisioned the remarkable Murty Classical Library project when you were studying at Harvard. So what was the inspiration?
Yeah, so when I was taking these philosophy classes, in one of the classes, somebody showed me this book once, and I said, hey, what is this? And they said, no, it was some Greek book translated to English. And I was fascinated because it was a small book.
Yeah.
You open it to the left-hand side is the original text, on the right-hand side is the translation. And this was a philosophy PhD student who was using this book, and he was referring to it a lot for his work. And then I spoke to my professor, friend at Harvard, and his name is Parimal. He's a professor of Indian philosophy and so on.
Okay.
And I said, hey, what is this Loeb? And then he told me, he said, no, look, 120 years ago, man, Loeb had this idea that everybody must read Greek and Latin.
Yeah.
Why don't they read it? Yeah. So apparently he came from some banking family from Europe or something, and he's not very interested in all of that. Instead, he was interested in Greek and Latin. So he started this thing to get more people to read Greek and Latin. And his definition was, these books must be fit into a gentleman's coat pocket. That's why they're small.
Okay.
The dimensions, or at least this is what I'm told, And he envisioned a future where all of Western civilization will read these kinds of books. And I think this series has now survived for 100 years, and they've been remarkably successful in keeping Greek and Latin alive in mainstream consciousness. In academia, outside academia, schools, etc. and so on. Anytime you want, any good translation of these Greek and Latin texts, you're going to buy a Loeb book. And they do a few books every year and so on. So it's a very large, successful foundation. So I was very deeply inspired. And I thought, hey, that's for Greek and Latin, so hamara kya hai? Right? So, and of course, in India there's Sanskrit.
Yeah.
But there's also, you take my mother tongue, Kannada. I can read and write contemporary Kannada, of course. But there's also Hale Kannada, which is older Kannada, or old classical Kannada, let's say. Or there is old Tamil, classical Tamil, medieval Bangla, etc. And so on. So by some definition, you have classical languages in India also. And so, therefore, somewhere I had this desire saying, okay, maybe I want to do something this for India. And so that's really, and then one thing led to another, and I met people.
Yeah.
So I met a very good professor turned publisher at Harvard University Press named Sharmila Sen. And she was fantastic. She was born and raised in Cambridge, in Massachusetts. And she used to be a professor at Harvard English. Then she moved to the press to publish books. And she had such wonderful energy. And she then opened my eyes to even larger possibility across this and so on. So that's kind of how we got going.
When you spoke about languages, there's also Avadi, Pali that I read in your library.
Yes, Pali, yes.
Yeah. Tulu.
Apabhramsha. Yeah.
So was it difficult to get translators in these languages?
No, so, let me give you some stats.
Yeah.
So it's now been 10 years since we started this project.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. We launched in January 2015. We had a big launch. We had a launch in Delhi, then we had one in Bangalore, Jaipur Literary Festival, London, this, that, world tour, and so on. And our goal, by the way, is to translate and publish these books for the next 100 years. So I wanted to outlive all of us.
Yeah.
I mean, these books should outlive all of us, frankly, more than anything. And so
Wonderful
we've just finished at just the first 10 years. In these 10 years, we've translated and published about 50 volumes. Okay. So every year we do a few volumes, and they typically come out in January. These books are available on all our Indian e-commerce websites and so on. Yeah.
But they're not pocket size.
No. I don't have this gentleman kind of notion. No. I mean, I think everyone should read them, but these books are bigger. Okay. We've done 50 volumes. These 50 volumes that we have done span 14 languages. And in fact, I've written down, let me give you a sense of the languages that they cover so far. Apabhramsha, Bangla, Hindi, Kannada, classical forms of all of these, Marathi, Pali, Punjabi, Persian, Prakrit, Sanskrit, Sindhi, Telugu and Urdu. So 14 languages.
Wow, yeah.
Right, which, I mean, including these languages. And they span about, if you take the oldest book that we have done to the most recent, and these are literary books, it spans about 2,500 years of Indian history and literary tradition, which is quite something. And they span, if you kind of put them on a map, okay, where might this text have come from and so on, and you draw this convex shape around it, they span roughly 6.8 million kilometers of space, right? So really through space and time, they transcend, space and time.
Yeah.
Through space and time, they cover an enormous large region of India. I had this thing at the 10th year celebration in Bangalore saying, look, my niece Anushka was asking me, saying, Rohan Mama, why are these books so important? And I said to her, saying, look, the way to understand the importance of these books is, these books are time machines. Because in an instant, with any of these books, you open the oldest book, it'll tell you what life was like, at least from a certain perspective, 2,500 years ago.
Yeah.
You can then take the next book and zoom to 300 years later or 400 years later. Suddenly the language changes and the context changes and so on.
Yeah.
These books truly that way, there's something very unique about classics, right? Classics are very old books. They're literature. They represent so much of our past, our history, our traditions, literary traditions, thoughts, ideas of of a living culture. This is not some theoretical thing. This is a culture you and I and everybody here kind of live today, and they all come from someplace, and you can trace it into some of these things. So, and to give you a sense, we have worked with nearly 50 scholars, somewhere there about some number like that, across several countries. Of course, starting with India, we have many translators, and our translators aren't hobby translators, because these are done by truly good scholars.
Specialized,
Yeah, these are people who dedicate their lives to these languages. So you have translators in India, scholars in India. For example, in Bangalore itself, Professor Vanamala Vishwanatha, who's done the book on King Harishchandra, Raghavanka, roughly 800 years ago, medieval Kannada poet, who wrote this great poem of the story of King Harishchandra. And King Harishchandra is very important, in terms of his ideas influenced Mahatma Gandhi. They also influenced a lot of discourse, certainly in formation of India and so on. And so this 12th century medieval Kannada poem, translated by Professor Vanamala Vishwanatha here. In fact, she even sung the original and song, which we have recorded and released for free. We have translators in Israel, translators in the UK, translators in the US, translators in Canada, translators in Italy, Germany, Sri Lanka. I'm forgetting a few more countries, but we have a couple more, right? And by the way, I get emails all the time from people I don't know who are using these books. So I made a count, approximately how many, and usually I get lots of emails from professors. Oh, thank you, these are wonderful, I'm using them for my class and so on. To date, 87 universities around the globe are utilizing these books. To me, these books are actually, it's not only meant for universities. Ideally, you and I and every one of us should be, this is literature, right? But to me, still the 87 is still impressive, because that means around the world. By the way, most of these are universities outside India who are fascinated. There are universities around the world where the definition of classics is no longer Greek and Latin. Or not just Greek and Latin, I should say. That's the right way of saying it. The definition has been broadened to include our Indian classics. Our books are now toe-to-toe with the Greek and Latin classics. And that's how it should be. Right? Why, and I have so many professors write to me saying, thank you, before this, I only used to use Greek and Latin texts. Now I'm using a medieval Kannada text in my classroom in California. How wonderful. So students there are going to learn about our land, our culture, language. How wonderful. Because we have grown up reading, Greek and Latin texts ourselves in India, at least in our syllabus, right? We read Ulysses, which is great. But how wonderful to be able to export even our culture around the world, right? So this is kind of, in some sense, what we've done in 10 years.
So you said outside India. Do you have plans to get them across universities in India?
See, we can produce these books. It's left for universities to adopt them. To me, my biggest desire and my ardent hope that ultimately our own people in India, we read our own classics.
Absolutely.
Okay, it's important that the world reads it, the world values. Of course, there's value and merit to it. I don't deny it. But it's incomplete if we Indians ourselves don't treasure our own classics.
I agree.
Right? I mean, the other day I met a student who said he's a philosophy undergraduate student at one of the universities in India. I said, okay, great, tell me your favorite Indian philosopher. He said, no, we don't read Indian philosophy. And I was thinking, hey man, how you should read philosophers around the world, because you will get a diverse perspective. But how do you not know one Indian philosopher? How can that be? Right? That is a strange thing.
Sad.
So, I mean, even you do any central syllabus, CBSE, ICSE, whatever, by and large, you will never read any classical Indian texts. So my ardent hope is, whether it's in schools or colleges and so on, much like, for example, at Harvard, you can't graduate without taking courses in classics. It doesn't matter if you're a maths major or a economics major or history major.
Yeah.
Everyone has to do a certain set of courses, which includes classics. Why in India, in my opinion, people doesn't matter if you're a lawyer, doctor, engineer, whatever, economist, you should also be able to read Indian classics, right?
I agree.
So,
would you like to mention any special scholars or editors who made some outstanding contributions to your library?
Great question. Professor Vanmala Vishwanathan.
Yeah.
There are many. There are many who, I think, over the years have added tremendous value. The thing that surprised me the most was I came to learn of, I think to my last count, there were at least the people across 14 to 18 countries who are or will help us do these translations. And so I found that utterly fascinating, that there are people around the world who are deeply interested in learning, studying and cherishing our languages and our texts and culture. And that's pretty cool, right? Because our history books never told us this. That, you think of it this way, America's greatest, in some sense, one of its important powers is soft power, is export of Hollywood, I guess. People watch these movies and, to want to emulate all these lifestyles, etc. and so on. But we also have culture that's soft power. Yeah. We have literature, we have these kinds of things. Yeah. And this is only one example, it's not the only one, right? And so I take tremendous pride in that. And so there are lots of scholars.
Do you have plans of converting these classical libraries using AI tools into digital media in future?
Topic very dear to my heart. Yes and no. So let me give you an example. I was asked this very question 10 years ago at our MCLI launch event in London.
Okay.
The then Indian High Commissioner to the UK, very good man, very learned man, had hosted the MCLI launch at the Indian Embassy, an Indian High Commission.
Okay.
And a lot of people had come, and so somebody asked me this question at the time. And in the audience was a person named Christopher Shackle, whom I had got to know right before the event. And Chris Shackle had translated our Bulle Shah.
Okay.
So I asked him, what's your life story? And so, how did you get into Punjabi? An Englishman living in London. And he told me his story of how basically for 54 years, when he was a young student, Chris Shackle, right? So he said, look, he saw a job opening for Punjabi. He was a young student. He must have been a student of the classics, I presume. And he decided to learn the language. Since then, for 50 odd years, he's been a scholar of Punjabi. He came to India, learned, so on, etc. I mean, this is true mastery, right? Like someone who's so dedicated his whole life to a language and expertise and texts around it. So at the time, my answer was, I don't yet know how to make technology as good as Chris Shackle. I don't know at the time. That's what I said. But I think now my answer is a little bit more nuanced, thanks to all these advances that have happened. I think as long as we can find scholars around the world, including in India, who can do very high quality translations, we need their help. That will never go away.
Yeah.
Having said that, let's say we are very successful in our mission. We do 5 volumes a year. In 100 years, we have done 500 volumes across 14 languages. Let's even assume somehow that instead of 5, we make it 10 volumes a year. So best case scenario, let's say, amazing scenario, let's say we would have done 1,000 volumes across 14 classical languages. But in these each one of these 14 classical languages, like you take classical Tamil, you take classic Sanskrit, you take old Kannada, Hale Kannada. Across all of them, totally you have some millions of texts. I'm talking just the classical forms, not the contemporary forms. So 1,000 divided by million, right, equals basically 0. What I'm trying to say is, even if we manage to do 1,000, in the vast sea of these millions of texts, most of them will still remain untranslated. And that's a real challenge according to me. So what can we do? Because if, it's a fact that, my generation, now the next generation, the generation after that, your kids, etc., they are not reading classical Kannada or classical Tamil or whatever and so on, right? They're all studying engineering, medicine, law, etc. and so on. And it's not blaming anyone, it's just how it is.
Yeah.
So my worry is what will happen in 100 years from now?
Yeah. So Rohan, what's been your greatest achievement so far?
I don't know, greatest. I'm not programmed to think of quote unquote achievement and greatest. I don't know about that. But I feel very grateful to be a father. And I don't think I would have understood it until I became one. When I was younger, I thought, okay, it was very nice to have done a PhD and published papers. And I never thought of those things as greatest achievement. I just thought, okay, hey, I'm glad I have an opportunity to do these things. Yeah. And I used to excitedly tell people about all of those things, right, when they asked me. But the experience I've had of becoming a father, nothing I have ever felt compares to that. And it's not an achievement clearly because a lot of people have kids, so I don't want to call it greatest. Nothing. It's not unique to me. Yeah. But in just my own limited frame of reality, it is the most meaningful thing that I've experienced.
Yeah, and that feeling is unmatched.
Yes. Yes.
Should we do a quick rapid fire?
Yes.
Texting or talking?
Clearly talking.
Sourdough or wheat?
Neither.
Okay. Bisibele or biryani?
Definitely bisibele.
Badminton or pickleball?
Neither.
Okay. For a journal, paper or computer?
Paper.
Okay. Trump or Sunak as a politician?
Definitely Rishi. I mean, only because, I know him.
Rohan Murty or Elon Musk as an entrepreneur?
I only know my father all too well, and obviously I'm biased. So, him.
Okay. Sudha Murty or Ruskin Bond as children's author?
I can't pick either. I like them both in different ways.
Okay. If not an entrepreneur, what would you be?
A professor.
Any favorite holiday destination?
No. I don't have that patience, or somehow the holiday thing, it doesn't work for me.
Nickname your parents used to call you?
My mother, ever since I was young, and I don't know why, it has nothing to do with anyone else. I can remember when I was 6 or 7, since then has called me Bill. And must be, there's some connection, I don't know what. But people are like, oh, Bill Gates. No. This is long before Bill Gates made any money and so on. So no, Bill. And my father's called me Bull.
Wonderful. Scale of 1 to 10, how good of a driver are you?
I'm reasonable, I'm 8.
Favorite childhood TV show?
Oh, let me say childhood movie instead.
Okay.
Christopher Reeve's Superman from 1978. Even why childhood, even today?
Any favorite ghazals from the classics?
No, I'm not as familiar with ghazals, so
okay.
I can't. I know more of Sanskrit and South Indian bhajans. That's what I grew up with. Yeah. So, M.S. Subbalakshmi singing them, that kind, right?
Any favorite library from around the world?
The one that has left a lasting impression on me is British Library in Bangalore. When I was young, I went to it and, you're small, so it feels big and it always remained in you. Now when I go as an adult, right, I've seen bigger libraries in that sense. Harvard has an outstanding library, the Widener Library. I remember there's a wonderful public library in Seattle, the Seattle Public Library.
Okay.
And so on. I mean, there are lots to name. Yeah.
Who has it easier, men or women?
Without a shadow of doubt, men. I think across all societies and through time, for whatever reason, I think the expectation from women is consistently higher and starting at an earlier age.
What does a person need to be happy?
I don't know what someone needs to be happy, because what makes me happy versus what makes you happy is so different. So I've learned in life, it's like this John Adams quote, the second president of the United States. He said, the older I grow, the less I seem to know. 100% I find that to be the case in my life. When I was in my 20s, I was very certain I knew life. Now I'm like, actually, I don't know much about. Maybe, in my case, what I can only answer for myself. I think perhaps reasonable expectations of people is probably a necessary ingredient. Reasonable, underline. Unreasonable expectations probably never a good idea.
Yes, that's a bad idea. Yeah. 5 qualities in a partner you look for?
What kind of partner? Like
life partner.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Let me answer it this way. See, I've become very smart. Everything my wife has is the perfect qualities I look for.
Okay.
There you go.
Can you name 1 or 2?
Oh, kindness. I mean, I mean the most serious way. Yes, kindness. To me, that's the most overpowering and most scarce quality I have found in people. I find plenty of everything else, but I don't find plenty of kindness. Genuine kindness. Which I tell my wife it's her super strength. She's like, what about this and this? I've done this. All of that's great, but for me, it's kindness.
Wonderful. Last question. Tell us one creative way to use AI for family time.
Family time, I don't know. What? I don't yet know.
Plan a meal, buy gifts.
No, I don't use it for any of these things. So I've never used it as yet. Maybe I'm still learning how to spend family time.
Okay.
Like I read, some friends of mine have gifted me astronomy for babies, quantum mechanics for babies. One of my friends, Vedika, who's a professor at Stanford, she gifted our son quantum computing for babies. So these are the ways in which I've learned to do family time, reading these nerdy books for him. So maybe I'll figure out the answer to your question. Yeah.
Thank you, Rohan, for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.